right. Well, hello, seventh graders. So this was just kind of a quick application activity, hopefully allowing you to apply some of the things that you should have pulled out of your phenomenon investigation regarding the humpback whale and the scissor-tailed flycatcher. Now, one of the big things that I wanted us to kind of pull out of that through our investigation was the various roles of organisms within an ecosystem. So what you were working with here was a food web of a particular ecosystem. Now, this is a pretty simplified and very arbitrary ecosystem, but it is an example food web and ecosystem nonetheless. So what your job was to try and classify or label these organisms based on their role in the ecosystem. These are the primary roles that organisms can play in an ecosystem. And we can make this even simpler, and we could say that organisms are either decomposers, producers, or consumers. However, my hope was in your investigation that you were able to see some classifications of consumers. Now, hopefully, you looking at this and through your work, you realize that in this ecosystem, based on the food web that you're seeing, there are no decomposers. There is nothing that is breaking down non-living material. Okay? So we have these four remaining labels or classifications to place on this food web. So let's start at the bottom. Tomato plant. Tomato plant is a producer. Now, why is it a producer? Well, it produces the energy that this ecosystem needs to thrive. And where does that energy come from that the tomato plant then produces? Well, that energy comes from the sun. Ultimately, all energy in an ecosystem comes from the sun. But we need this role of a producer to then spread that energy throughout the rest of the ecosystem. Okay? That is the only producer in this ecosystem. So I'm going to cross that off my list. Now, primary consumers. Our rule of thumb for primary consumers. Well, I guess there's two of them, okay? Primary consumers eat producers. And because primary consumers eat producers, that means that primary consumers are herbivores. Okay? Producers are plants. Always. Okay? So primary consumers being herbivores, they eat plants. So in your food web here, you should have labeled the goat as a primary consumer. The rabbit is a primary consumer. And the rat is a primary consumer. And that's it. Those are the only herbivores. Those are the only primary consumers in this food web. Now, secondary consumers. Our secondary consumers always eat or consume primary consumers. But that is also going to make secondary consumers either carnivores or omnivores. Okay? So secondary consumers, they could eat producers. But more often than not, they eat primary consumers. Okay? So based on this food web, our secondary consumers are the fox, the wildcat, the owl, and the snake. Okay, so again, these are either carnivores, which eat meat, or they're omnivores, which means that they eat both plants and they eat meat. And yes, you could consider human beings as omnivores. Okay? Now, tertiary consumers. These are the top dogs in an ecosystem. They are the ultimate predator. Nothing eats or consumes a tertiary consumer. So based on this ecosystem, based on this food web, we actually have two tertiary consumers. We have the lion and we have the hawk. Those are our two tertiary consumers. Now, I want us to note something interesting here in this food web. And this is not unique to this very simplified food web. There are very distinct levels that we can see in terms of this ecosystem, in terms of this food web. And to understand what these levels actually are representing, or what they're showing us, or what they are, I want you to quickly consider what the arrows in this food web are telling us. Okay, this is a visual model. We should try and understand what every aspect of this is showing us. So take a couple seconds. What do you think these arrows are actually showing us? Now, I'm guessing many of you are thinking that these arrows are showing us which animal is eating what, right? Or which animal is getting eaten by what. But more specifically, in a science context, these arrows are showing us how energy is flowing between these very defined levels that we have here. And notice how these arrows are crossing these boundaries. And I could even add another level. I could have sun, Mr. Golden Sun over here. And I could have an arrow from the sun going to my tomato plant. This is then another level. So the big takeaway from this quick activity here, not only being able to understand the different roles that organisms play in an ecosystem, but also understanding how energy flows between specific roles in an ecosystem, between these specific levels. Energy only flows one way in an ecosystem. An ecosystem gets its energy from the sun. That sun moves to the producers. It moves to this level here. The energy then moves into this level where our primary consumers are, because they are the ones eating the producers. Energy then flows into this level when the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. And then finally, energy flows from this level to the tertiary level when our top dogs, our ultimate predators, eat our secondary consumers. And what's interesting, and I want you to think about this, and we're going to talk more about this next week, what would happen if one of these animals was removed or became extinct? How drastically would that affect the ecosystem? How drastically would that affect the energy flow in this food web and in this ecosystem? Something to think about before our work next week. So, have Have a lovely weekend, 7th graders. I want you to keep this this activity sheet because I think it's a great working model for us moving forward. And we're going to dig deeper into ecosystems when we see each other next week. Take care.